Pode começar.
Pode começar, então. Todo mundo está ouvindo? Não. Online? Estão ouvindo online agora? Sim. Ok. Well, good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We had some technical issues here. So I'm very glad to have today here Professor José Fuentes from Penn State. He is a micrometeorologist. We just learned that we met like 20 years more ago when I was an undergrad student in LBA in Rondônia. And he has been working with the Amazon, well, probably more than that. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And bom dia a todos. I'm going to speak in English today so that I can go with the slides that I have put together. As Rachel mentioned, I have done a lot of research in the Amazon, mostly in processes related to the atmospheric boundary layer. And today I will speak about these gases that are produced by vegetation, and I will end by sharing some ideas about what is happening to the climate in the Amazon region. So first of all, I want to share with you how we actually learn the names of or species of gases produced by the plants. Those are very important steps to know. And then I will highlight as to what has been the impetus of this research, both in the context of North America, where I lived, and also in the Amazon. And I will share with you some key results that we recently obtained as part of the studies that we have been doing related to the Go Amazon project that was a collaborative project between Brazil and the United States. And I will highlight one key element that up until now or up until recently we didn't know, and those are about the interactions that happens between the regimes of air turbulence in plant canopy and the chemistry that takes place in that environment. And then, as I mentioned, I will talk a little bit about the responses of the rainforest to the emerging climate features. I would like you to know that all plants release these gases that we call them hydrocarbons. And there is a very fundamental ecological role or reason why plants release these gases. In the case of flowers, for example, they release these compounds to let the pollinators know that pollen and the nectar is ready to be harvested. And right there, those gases are emitted just as a way for plants to communicate with the pollinators. But there are, other elements of the plant, such as leaves, the barks, that produce these gases. And these gases, once they are released, they exist in the atmosphere in trace amounts. We often use the units of either molar mixing ratio or just the concentration, and they are in the sub-parts per billion, most of the gases, and some gases such as isoprene in parts per billion. But the fact is that these gases are super reactive in the environment, and the key attributes of those molecules is that they have what we call the double bonds in air chemistry. So the simplest molecule that is produced by the plants is the isoprene, and you can see it here on this slide. There are two double bonds on the isoprene molecule. All the molecules that have double bonds basically become super reactive when they interact with oxidants such as ozone, hydroxyl radical, and the nitrate radical. And then when we go into the monoterpenes here, such as the limonene, then you can see that those are larger molecules, and therefore the probability for reaction increases simply because there is the possibility that those molecules will interact with the oxidants right there. And then going to the other family of gases, such as the cryophyllene, that's when you have 3 isoprenoid molecules comprising the molecules. And then we have some unique families of gases, such as the benzenoids, like this cinnamaldehyde here. And these are the gases that are abundantly produced by flowers to allow the pollination of the plants. So part of the reason why we study these gases, we atmospheric scientists, is that these gases then can drive the oxidation capacity of the lower atmosphere. In addition, these gases, once they react, can actually lead to the formation of secondary organic aerosols. As atmospheric scientists, we know that in order for clouds to form, we need to have particles, we need to have aerosols. And so some of these aerosols that are formed from these gases can then become activated into cloud condensation nuclei, which are the precursors for cloud formation processes. And the manner in which we actually identify the chemical species and determine the emission rates of these molecules is that first we have to capture the foliage or the leaves that we want to study. And then we put these cuvettes or chambers around them, and the microenvironment in that chamber has to be ideally similar to what is in the outdoors. And the purpose is that we want to learn, we want to investigate, we want to determine the emission rates of these gases as a function of the variables that govern or dictate the emissions. That's when we do that. So we do that with leaves. I've been doing this lately with flowers. I've been doing a lot of work in that area. And the way we estimate the emissions is that we basically determine the concentration of the gases leaving the cuvette or the chamber minus the concentration of the gas enter the chamber, and then here in this equation we apply the conservation of mass, where we take the difference in the concentration of the gas multiplied by the flow rates, divided by the amount of biomass enclosed in the cuvette, and we get the emissions. The way that we use to determine the identity of these molecules is that we use instruments such as the gas chromatograph mass selective detector that you see on the right-hand side here. This is all technology that we actually used way back when I began this work, but nowadays we use more advanced technologies to do that. So this is how we do this, and the reason we actually want to do these studies is that we then develop functional relationships to express the emissions of these gases as a function of those variables. And those are the numerical models that we need in both the climate models as well as the air quality models. And here are the sample results that we have. If you look at the top plot right here, we have on the vertical axis the emission of isoprene as a function of the foliage temperature. And as you can learn here, the emissions of isoprene exponentially increase with temperature up to an optimum point right there, which is around 40 degrees Celsius. Thereafter, the emissions decline precipitously, even though I only have one data point here, but based on other studies, that's the general pattern of the emissions there. And if you examine that relation carefully, this is exactly the same relationship that we have when we want to study the photosynthesis of plants. And part of the reason why the same is for isoprene is that the isoprene molecule is biosynthesized in the chloroplast of the cell of the plants, and that is part of the carboxylation process. In other words, the biosynthesis of the isoprene molecule is activated by an enzyme, and most enzymes actually follow these functional relationship that you see there. This is the so-called the Arrhenius expression that we use. So there is some sort of an activation energy involved in here. And so this equation that you see here on the top of the figure, that is the relationship that we need in our air quality models and in the climate models as well. So I'll talk a little bit about this later here. You can see the form in which we actually utilize that equation. In the case of the isoprene emission as a function of the photosynthetic photon flux density, you can see a parabolic expression right there. And again, this is explained in terms of the fact that the carboxylation process in plants is an energy-mediated process. In other words, in order to have biosynthesis of isoprene, the plants have to carry out the process of photosynthesis. And therefore, this is the reason why we only experience isoprene emissions during the daytime. And this, again, is the model that we have developed and that we include in those both regional and global models. And in the case of the monoterpenes, actually, that's very different, because monoterpenes basically are, once they are biosynthesized, these molecules actually stay on the epidermis or the cuticle of the leaves, on the stems, or on the barks of trees, and then you have this resin that basically is just simply volatilizing as a function of the temperature you see on the horizontal axis. And this is kind of a very similar expression, actually, that we see for the thermodynamics of water vapor. So that's something that is very, very attractable, because then we can use this simple relationship here to express the emission of the monoterpenes. So this ES that you see there, that stands for the emission of the normalized at the given temperature and at given light for the case of the isoprene. And so the question now that I want to answer here is why, we atmospheric scientists are interested in this. Well, in the context of where I live in the United States, you all know that in many large urban places, the environment has experienced very severe episodes of air pollution. You may probably have heard about Los Angeles, which is the most common place where we see very intense air pollution. The eastern part of the United States has been also plagued with severe air pollution episodes. And so many years ago, way back in the 1980s, we realized that these plants are emitting these gases such as isoprene. And these gases then react with the oxidants of ozone, the hydroxyl radical, and the nitrate radical. And so when these reactions take place in the presence of the nitric oxide in the urban rural atmosphere, nitric oxide is released from the soils if there is some microbial activity that are related to the nitrification, the denitrification process. And so these molecules basically react, they interact with the nitric oxide, and they produce more free radicals here. Those are the radicals right there. And then the key molecule that is produced in that process is the nitrogen dioxide, which is the immediate precursor to the ozone formation, simply because the nitrogen dioxide can undergo photolysis, give you the oxygen atom that combines with oxygen to give you the ozone. In addition, these reactions lead to the formation of secondary organic aerosols. These are aerosols whose aerodynamic diameters typically are less than 600 nanometers. These are in the submicron scale like that. So this is something that we had to really understand in the 1980s, and then also when the forests, when the trees are upwind of the city, then we see the formation of these gases interacting with the anthropogenically emitted nitric oxide, more volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide, and then you have this very complicated chemistry that is taking place that in the end results in the formation of ozone, carbon monoxide, nitric acid, nitrous acid, and a carcinogenic molecule called peroxyacetyl nitrates. All of these gases that I circle right here are known as the smog constituents, because smog is a name that we have to say that these gases are photochemically produced. In the case of ozone, ozone is not produced by any anthropogenic activity, but rather is transported from the lower stratosphere down to the troposphere and is photochemically produced in the lower layers of the atmosphere. So that's the reason why we began to study these gases. Lately, we learned that these secondary organic aerosols become very important as well. And the importance there is mostly because these aerosols, once out there in the air, they interact with the sunlight, and then they attenuate that light coming or reaching the surface and producing some net cooling effect. In addition, and perhaps more importantly, these secondary organic aerosols, particularly the ones that are formed under the influences of the urban environment, they have sufficient appropriate constituents that can allow these aerosols to serve as cloud condensation nuclei, and therefore they can impact cloud formation processes. And in fact, as I will show you later, this was one of the impetus of the Go Amazon study that we did in 2014 and 2015 in the Amazon. And here is the logo for the Go Amazon project you see there. Gilberto Fish and so many other colleagues from Brazil came to work together. I am here to tell you that the part of the project that we did, which is in the central Amazon, as I'll show you in a moment, would have not been that successful if we did not have the partnership, the meaningful collaboration with our Brazilian colleagues. Going from undergraduate students, as Rachel was way back in the TRIM LBA era, all the way up to senior colleagues such as Gilberto and many others in Brazil. So we went to actually do these studies, but now in this case we went to install instruments above the forest. In this case we wanted to study the emissions of these gases, but without touching the forest or the leaves, as I did when I show you the cuvettes. And so, for example, when we do the fluxes, we use knowledge of air turbulence as the W prime here, which we get from a sonic anemometer right there, and then the chi prime, that's the perturbation of the concentration of these gases that we get from the new technology we use these days, using some spectrometers that I will share with you in a moment. And so one of the key research questions that we formulated for the Go Amazon is how the thermodynamic state of the boundary layer, as represented in this picture, in this cartoon, by the virtual potential temperature profile. This is basically what we call the convective boundary layer, whose depth is denoted by this dotted line right there, where you see the strong temperature inversion starts right there. So we wanted to know how much of these gases that are produced by the forest can react in the boundary layer, and how much can actually be detrained out of the boundary layer into the cloud layer. And also we wanted to know how much of these become secondary organic aerosols that will actually be ingested into the clouds. In addition, what we have also done is to understand how the turbulence environment is interacting with the emissions of these gases. So in the Amazon forest, the turbulence is driven by these features that we call sweeps. These are air currents that very swiftly and strongly transport air from above, from the mixed layer, into the canopy. And then once these air parcels transport ozone, hydroxyl radical, nitro radical, all of these oxidants interact with the gases emitted in the plant canopy. And we wanted to know the extent of that air chemistry in the plant canopy. And then, of course, the other feature is that eventually we have these very intense ejections that transport not only the emissions of these gases, but also the reaction products and the secondary organic aerosols that are produced within the plant canopies. So this was a very unique study. As far as we can tell, this has been one of the first studies done in the rainforest to actually link the turbulence and the air chemistry and the emissions together, plus the thermodynamics of the boundary layer. And so, just to give you an idea where we did this study, all of you recognize Manaus here, and then we operate in the central Amazon at a site called CF2 that is located about 60 kilometers northwest from Manaus. And then we actually we're part of the T3 here, where it's just downwind from Manaus, where we operated the Tether balloon, and the colleagues from the United States and Brazil were operating the instruments provided by the Department of Energy right there. So this site was very well instrumented right there. I want to note that this is the tower that we had. It's a 50-meter tower. This is an existing tower. This was established many years ago. And then the other feature that I want to tell you is that the average canopy height is roughly 30 meters, and then that's the average. And then the leaf area around the tower changes between 6 and 7.3. It's pretty dense canopy that we saw over there. And then again, I want to repeat that with the help from many junior early career scientists from Brazil, we were able to put 11 sonic anemometers. You can see one here, another one down there. You can see the tower there. And then we were able to deploy the intake of the gas analyzers in this yellow picture you see there, and then with the tubing we pass all that air through the gas analyzers, through the proton transfer reaction mass spectrometer. That's what we call the PTRMS right here. And then also we have the regular glass chromatograph with a mass selector detector. And we also brought a tether balloon. This is a tether balloon that towards the end of the field campaign was operated nearby the CF2 tower. So we have some of that data there. So I want to then move on to share with you these results. So in the rainforest, you have that this ecosystem represents the largest source of plants-emitted gases anywhere on the planet Earth. And the dominant species are actually isoprene. The isoprene molecule is the most dominant, followed by the methanol molecule here, which I will explain in a moment. And then you can see here that the terpenes actually do not comprise the dominant family of gases, only 6%. Then we also detected acetone, acetaldehyde. Of course, this is a reaction product. And then we have these other two species that are basically reaction products from the isoprene molecule. So we basically provide the statement here that these molecules basically represents the key precursors to secondary organic aerosol formation in the rainforest. And then in this picture here, in this slide, I want to show you on the right-hand side that we have basically the plot for the leaf area density against the altitude. And you can see here that there are some trees around the tower that are almost 40 meters tall. The bulk of the foliage is basically confined between 20 and 10 meters right there. That's where we have the maximum amount of foliage. And if you look at what I mentioned earlier, the turbulence regime as represented by the standard deviation of the vertical velocity, you can see that above the plant canopy, above 30, we have almost invariant turbulence with altitude. And then the turbulence basically decreases to the point that basically in the lower part of the canopy there is almost no turbulence. Therefore, this low turbulence in the lower part of the canopy allows these air parcels to remain there for a long time in such a way that the turbulent length scales are comparable to the chemical lifetimes of the molecules produced by the canopy. So in other words, there is plenty of time here for these reactions to take place. And then the next plot is for the monoterpenes, and you can see that in the case of the monoterpenes, the abundances of these gases in the air are almost invariant with the depth of the canopy, and that is explained in terms of the fact that the emissions of monoterpenes are driven by temperature only. Whereas in the case of the isoprene, which is the other next plot here, you can see that the highest levels of isoprene are found around 20 meters, which is where the crown of the forest is, and the emissions actually depend on temperature and the photosynthetically active radiation. And so most of the lights in the rainforest is intercepted basically from 20 meters all the way up to the top of the canopy. And then you can see the last plot here, ozone plotted against height. You can see that in the tropics during this time of the year in October, the levels of ozone are in the order of 30, no more than 40 parts per billion. That's the mixing ratio there. But there is plenty of ozone, of course, in the canopy for the reactions of the plant's emitted gases to take place. And then this is a very busy diagram here. In this diagram, what I want to basically show you is these names of the compounds on the right-hand side, that the rainforest produces a lot of monoterpenes, many sesquiterpenes, also fatty acid derivatives and the benzonoid molecules that I mentioned a moment ago. Part of the reason why you don't see a very well-structured ambient level distribution for these gases is that these monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes are emitted by both the foliage, the leaves, and the flowers. And when you visit this forest, you can find flowers almost at any level in the canopy. That's precisely why we get this very convoluted, very difficult to discern plot in the distribution of these gases. And so let me just share the results with you. One of the key elements that we learned as part of this project is that the emissions of gases such as isoprene strongly depend on the time of the growing season in the Amazon. I'm showing you here for the data for the month of June, September, December, and January. And you can see that the maximum levels are during the month of September. I will explain that in a moment. And then when we want to examine the levels of isoprene against the photosynthetically active radiation that you see here in the middle row of plots, you can see that during the morning, the emissions actually behave in one pathway, whereas when the local solar noon is reached, then the levels of the light are decreasing, then the emissions follow a different trajectory. And that is explained by the hysteresis in the behavior of the enzyme that is biosynthesizing the isoprene molecule in the leaves that you see there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, temperature is a really important variable driving the emissions. That's why you can see on these plots on the bottom row of figures that the ambient levels of isoprene almost exponentially change with the temperature in the environment. And then here are the fluxes of the isoprene that we estimated. These are the emission rates that I mentioned earlier, but at the ecosystem level. And so first, what I want to show you on the right-hand side is this green plot right there that tells the leaf area distribution going from the month of April to the month of January right there. So the months of June and July basically provide minimum biomass for the production of isoprene. But in addition, this is the time when we see the development of new leaves plotted here on the blue lines right there. So the leaves began to emerge in June, and in the case of young leaves, when they are developing, they do not release isoprene. So when there is leaf expansion, there is no isoprene emission, even though the leaves may be photosynthetically competent. And this is a process that we actually learned many years ago. I was one of those scientists who actually made that discovery way back in the 1990s. And so when the leaves are expanding, instead what they do is that they produce more methanol. This is why you see here highest level of methanol during the month of June on this bottom plot that you see here. And then, of course, as the leaves actually end the leaf expansion, then the methanol levels decrease, whereas the isoprene levels actually increase. So it's a really unique story that we were able to piece together here. Hence, the levels of the isoprene emissions are highest during the month of September, simply because the phenology of the leaves coincides with also with the temperature, because during September it's actually warmer than the other months that we have. So the phenology and the meteorology actually go together here. So it's a really interesting story that we were able to piece together right there. So this part of the presentation is probably mostly devoted to my fellow atmospheric chemists in the audience, either here in the auditorium or online. So first of all, I want to remind you that all of these gases here, I put the chemical formulas here, isoprene, the monoterpenes, and the sesquiterpenes, all of them react with the molecule ozone. The isoprene reaction with ozone is really small, that most of the time we ignore that reaction in our photochemical mechanisms. But when you have the reaction of monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes with ozone, we call that ozonolysis. And the ozonolysis is a unique reaction simply because when that happens, first of all, there is the formation of these radicals like the alkyl and the alkoxyl radical, plus another family of gases here that I am plotting here, defining on the right-hand side. But from that reaction of ozone and the monoterpenes, you see the direct formation of the hydroxyl radical. And this is one of the key oxidants. And so this is why we study these reactions in the atmosphere, because you may wish to remember that the hydroxyl radical, we call it the detergent of the atmosphere, because it reacts with almost anything. And so every time that the hydroxyl radicals is produced, that's very important for many atmospheric related processes. So you have that direct formation of the hydroxyl radical. In addition, the previous reactions that I outlined earlier will proceed and produce the nitrogen dioxide from the nitric oxide molecule, and that is the direct precursor to the ozone. And this, in the presence of light, will give you another hydroxyl radical. So one is mediated by the sunlight, and the other one is not. And this is why the coupling of emissions and turbulence that I mentioned earlier in the canopy is very important, because in the canopy, in the lower levels of the canopy, the light levels are really, really small. The actinic lights to do the photolysis of these molecules is really minuscule in that part of the canopy. And so here's one more explanation of that idea. First, I'm choosing here the monoterpene beta pinene. This is the molecule that you will actually detect in the air when you walk into, let's say, a pine forest. You're smelling the beta pinene, that scent that gives you the pine sol aroma. That's the molecule that you are detecting. And you can see here the double bond. Here's a double bond. So when the ozone molecule interacts with the beta pinene, so the double bond will open up and will give this other free radical. We call it Kriegel radical right here. You have the piece of the ozone molecule right there. And from there, we have the direct formation of the hydroxyl radical. In addition, there is this formation of this peculiar molecule, the formaldehyde, that can also undergo photolysis and give you the hydroxyl radical in the reaction. And the other pathway of the reaction is that we have another intermediate step here, and then you have the direct formation of the hydroxyl radical right there. And this reaction does not require light for it to take place. So that's why it's important. And so what we did for this study is that we basically had to implement a photochemical mechanism in a large eddy simulation study. And the idea there, as I introduced earlier, is that we wanted to quantify the hydroxyl radical yields from the ozonolysis of these monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes. And in order to achieve this goal, we had to develop a chemical mechanism that involves 34 reactions. And here we have the reaction of the hydroxyl radical with isoprene only, and this gives you the alkyl peroxide radical that will combine with the nitric oxide and give you the nitrogen dioxide I mentioned earlier, plus the formaldehyde molecule. So in a way, the isoprene reaction with the hydroxyl radical gives you some hydroxyl radical, but in a very indirect way. And then the reaction that we care the most is the monoterpene with the hydroxyl radical that will give you again another terpene hydroperoxide radical, and that's the one that will give you the direct emission or formation of the hydroxyl radical right there. So we did a sequence of these reactions with the ozone. That one gives you the 70% yield of the hydroxyl radical due to the reaction of the ozone with the monoterpene molecules in the air. So here are the sample reactions that actually follow right there. And then in order to run the large eddy simulation, first, of course, we need to do this is the air turbulence. For those in the audience who have seen the equations of motions or the filter Navier-Stokes equations using the Boussinesq approximation, here we have the advection, the pressure gradient force, the Bruyas term, and the subgrid scale of turbulence that we're doing. Here on the bottom part of the slide, I'm giving you the grid size for the model, 164 meters by 82 meters by 322 meters, and we use a resolution of 3.5 meters. When we say the subgrid scale, we mean below the 3.5 meters that we selected for the grid size. And then, more importantly, this term that has the variable d is basically what accounts for the interactions of the plant material, like leaves, branches, trunks, and the movement of the air parcels in the canopy. In other words, the turbulence. That's something that we did. That's what's very unique. And the person who was doing that was actually my collaborator here, Marcelo Chamecki, another Brazilian, who actually was helping with that. My job in this study was really to implement this equation here, which is the conservation of mass, where we have the inertial term here, and then the advection of the gas that we want to study. Then we have the transport in subgrid, the chemistry, the emissions, and the deposition. The emissions, this is where we have the equations I introduced to you earlier. This is why these light and temperature functions are very, very important. We can put them in large simulations. We can put them in regional models and even in climate models. That's basically what we have. And then this equation here is the energy equation that we have. And then, of course, we use the incompressible assumption in our model. So we have an article that we published last December or November, I think, last year. And Gilberto Fish mentioned Livia Freire, who is actually a professor now at USP São Carlos. And anyway, let me give you the results right here. First, let me introduce very quickly the results for the air turbulence. So in this case, I'm plotting here the normalized wind speed. Normalized, I mean the wind speed divided by the wind speed we see at the top of the canopy. And by and large, what you can see is that the vertical profile of the normalized wind speed, it's reasonably close to what we saw or experienced with the observations denoted here by these crosses, these symbols right there. Similarly, when we plotted normalized kinematic momentum flux against or normalized to the friction velocity, we get a reasonable agreement, except that we have some outliers there in the data. And so we are still trying to figure out whether it's something that we don't capture in the model or something that probably went peculiar for this level, particularly that we have in the canopy, because this is the one level. Also, when we plot the kinematic heat flux against time, you can see here that there is a very close agreement between the model results and what we actually estimated from the eddy covariance that we had out on the tower. And when we also plot the kinematic heat flux against the normalized heights, you can see that there is very close agreement between the model results and the observations from the eddy covariance. I think that a heat is one of the easiest or the heat flux is one of the easiest variables that we can actually do with most numerical models these days. And so here are the pieces of information related to the radiation for the simulation period, the wind speed, and also the air temperature. You can see here that we only capture in the simulations only half of the day. When you go to the tropics, basically you can, when you have only clouds, you don't have precipitation events, you can pretty early see that you will have a sinusoidal description of the variables out in the forest. And so this lower panel here on the figure, we have the integrated emissions of the isoprene and the monoterpenes. So that's basically what we see here. See, these are the emissions at the ecosystem level again. And so here are the results. First, I want to point out this equation where we compute the storage term, and then that is basically the average or normalized to the canopy heights of the flux emitted at the top of the canopy, and then we have, based on the emissions, in this flux, we have to include turbulence right there. And then we have the deposition and the chemistry that I mentioned earlier. And so the two dominant terms actually in this part of the storage term is the transport due to turbulence and the chemistry right there. So they seem to be almost in balance. And so the storage term hovers around 0 right there. Okay? So when we then analyze the hydroxyl radical formation or destruction rates, then what we can see is that the isoprene reacts with the hydroxyl radical. That's a very strong sink for the hydroxyl radical in the canopy. And then in the case of the monoterpenes, that's a smaller sink. But as I alluded earlier, the monoterpene reaction with ozone is actually the source of the hydroxyl radical right there. So you can learn the magnitude of the source and the magnitude of the sink. So if I can put this data together in a different way for selected periods such as 8 a.m., 10 a.m., and 12 noon, what you can see is that the strength of the sink here basically monotonically decreases with altitude. So there is something that is happening in the canopy, and it makes perfect sense because that's where the abundant levels of isoprene are, in the canopy. Conversely, in the case of the hydroxyl radical, we see a source when the reaction of the monoterpenes take place with the ozone. And so when I take the source to sink ratio, what I was able to learn is that in the lower part of the canopy, the source and the sink were almost in balance. And this is a new result that we hadn't seen before, albeit they come from model calculations, but it illustrates the facts that in-plant canopy reactions are very, very important, particularly when it comes to the reactions of monoterpenes with the oxidants. That's the key message that I want to describe with this one. So this is a very, very interesting result as far as we are concerned. And then let me end with an anecdote here, not an anecdote, but perhaps with an update that in a way puts these results that I share with you in the context of the emerging climate in the Amazon. So all of us, I think, are aware of the fact that the atmosphere of planet Earth is warming. And I think some of us even know that when we go from the period in the 1880s, when we began to take these climate records in a systematic manner, all the way up to the end of 22, we know that the atmosphere, on average, globally, has warmed by 1 degree. And in the last decade, as I have outlined here, the warming has been unprecedented. And even for this summer, the whole North America is experiencing a major heat wave never ever experienced during the instrumental record. Similarly, in Southern Europe, such as in Spain, Portugal, Southern France, Italy, there is another major heat wave. And one idea that I want to share with you is that even though we have these beautiful pictures to show, I should say probably sad pictures because it's not good that the planet is warming. What we know is that the degree of warming is not uniform throughout the planet Earth. There are 2 regions of the planet Earth that are warming much greater than the average of the planet Earth. One region is the Arctic. And that warming is explained due to the unique circulation patterns in the atmosphere in the Arctic region. And the other one is the ocean circulations that transport heat from the southern latitudes to the northern latitudes. The second region that is actually experiencing uneven warming is the Amazonian region. So in here on this cartoon, what I have done is to compute the temperature anomalies for that period from 2018 to 2022 when we had that rapid warming actually. And then what I have contrasted that to the climate norms that we still use the period 1951 to 1980. And then I went and I produced this blue box in the Amazon, and you can see that instead of actually observing 1 degree of warming, it's almost 2 degrees. In some instances, 2.5 degrees of warming that you see in the Amazon. So there are many climate features that we can point to that the Amazon is experiencing these emerging climate anomalies that will impact and are impacting those processes that I just shared with you. And so the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change this past March released these reports to call attention to the fact that if we consider the various scenarios here of having or experiencing 1.5 degree of warming, 2.3 degrees warming, or 4 degree warming at the global scale, those are averages at the global scale, then we're going to see some impacts. And if you followed all these lines here to the Amazon, where I have dotted there, you can see the anomaly in the Amazonia region for soil moisture. That's one of the most severely impacted variables, soil moisture, in the Amazon due to atmospheric warming that is going to take place. So I want to share this hypothesis with you that in the Amazon, because it is already experiencing prolonged droughts, these droughts are promoting more tree mortality. And if we have more tree mortality, therefore there is less biomass to produce these gases that I mentioned a moment ago, particularly isoprene. Also, the drier soils will engender less emissions of these nitrogen oxides. And so, but the other concurrent process that it will take place because of the drying of the environment is the biomass burning actually is going to increase, and that will be one feature that will contribute to the formation of unusual levels of nitrogen oxides in the Amazon basin. And because of the warming, whatever biomass we have in the Amazon will actually produce more isoprene or monoterpene emissions rather. That's why I use this color red to say greater emissions. So all those reactions that I explained earlier are going to change because the reactions that I explained to you a moment ago are for a regime of low nitrogen oxides. But now we will experience more nitrogen oxides, and so when all these reactions take place here of the monoterpenes, ozone, hydroxyl radical, there will be the formation of secondary organic aerosols whose chemical composition is not what we have been studying up until now. Pablo Artacho and many others in Brazil have done many and many studies in the Amazon on that topic. But because of these features of the climate, these particles then will have a composition that will clearly impact the activation of these particles into cloud condensation nuclei. And therefore, cloud formation processes are going to be impacted by these changes that are happening in the Amazon. And so this is a very important element. And perhaps some of you are thinking, well, this is a hypothesis, you are surmising here. But I want to share the knowledge with you that when we did the Go Amazon study, we had measurements in Manaus and in Manacapuru, where we were able to observe nitrogen oxides that exceeded 10 parts per billion. And then what we have done is to run some photochemical modeling studies in which we study the formation of oxidants for different levels of isoprene in this case. I don't have the data to share for the monoterpenes. And you can see that the formation of ozone, at least, exponentially increases with nitrogen oxides, and then there is a point where that will actually precipitate down simply because of the deposition and the formation of other gases that actually are transported away and have longer lifetimes. And the same thing for nitric acid, perovskite acetyl nitrates, and then these other molecules are the organic nitrates and the reactive nitrogen species. Here's the full name of the chemical species right there. And so this is something that is already happening in some cases. And so I want to leave you with this idea here that this line that I have here on this plot, where I'm plotting the ozone level against the time of day, this black line here represents what I showed you earlier, that in the Amazon ozone levels are around 30, 40 parts per million. When we do the calculations with the nitrogen oxide levels that we measured in Manakapuru, then we go from this regime of 20, 30 all the way up to 60, 70 parts per million of ozone. And so this is something that we have evidence for. Actually, we published this in an article about a year ago. And so this is something that we all need to pay attention, because the climate is changing, and so we need to continue actually with this line of research. So this is the last slide I have to share with you here, to say to you that in our case, Gilberto Fish and many others in Brazil, and I and others in the United States have spent most of our lives studying the thermodynamics of the convective boundary layer and also the stable boundary layer. Otávio Acevedo from Brazil is one of the leaders in this area of the stable boundary layers in the world. And so when we have this deep boundary layer here because of the warming, we're going to have these two regimes. So far, we've been studying the low nitrogen oxide environment, and you can see the formation of these chemical species here that give us the low ozone level. When we are in the high nitrogen oxide environment, that's when we're going to see the formation of more gases, second organic aerosols with different chemical composition that we have today. And so I want to repeat that the rainforest is the largest source of these plant-emitted gases anywhere on the planet. And not only that, it produces a great diversity of gases, you know, that can help keep us, some of us, busy studying the chemistry. But there are other gases, of course, that play some key ecological roles, such as pollination. And so the idea that I share here is that there is a very direct link between air turbulence and emissions and chemistry in the dense and tall forest canopies of the rainforest. And this is a new finding, that the oxidation of monoterpenes basically produce sufficient levels of hydroxyl radical in the canopy to enhance the destruction of the isoprene molecule in the plant canopy. So this is a very, very exciting research. Unfortunately, I need to say that most of our regional models do not capture the in-canopy chemical processes that I'm trying to highlight here. But I know that some colleagues are already paying attention to that. So there is ongoing work in that area. And with that, I want to first thank, you know, not only the agencies in the United States who funded the Go Amazon project, but also the Brazilian funding agencies. Without their support, I wouldn't be here sharing my science with you. And then the Fulbrights in the United States and in Brazil are supporting my visit in Brazil, which I am enjoying very much. And I actually end next week. Sadly, Gilberto has to ask me to leave and then come back another time, right, Gilberto? And muito obrigado pela atención.
Your wife Adela that say no, Jose has to come back.
No, she already made the assumption that you already kidnapped me forever.
Thank you so much, Jose. Do you have questions? Luciana and Marcia.
Jose, you mentioned that isoprene emission fluxes depend on plant phenology, right?
Yeah.
Does monoterpene fluxes also do?
They do, but they do not have the feature as isoprene that when the leaves are expanding, they don't actually produce the molecule isoprene. Whereas for the monoterpenes, actually they do.
Okay.
Yeah, they do. In fact, you may remember, that sometimes when the buds open up, sometimes that's when there is the highest emissions for some gases. For example, some plants first flower and then the flowers get converted into leaves. We had one species which we'll use for decoration at home. We call that plant dogwood. The flowers become leaves. Then the emissions of monoterpenes are highest when we have the flowers. And then the leaves produce less monoterpenes.
Okay.
Yeah. So there is a seasonality. And also the other element there is that, as you know, whether we are in the tropics or in the mid-latitude regions or the temperate regions, there is some variability in the temperature as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just a quick other question. You showed the last slides simulation showing the effect of NOx on isoprene concentrations. What did you use for that? Was that a box model?
We use the Whorf Chem model in a box configuration, okay. Yes. And we use the photochemical mechanism, the RACAM2, the Regional Atmospheric Chemistry Model developed by Bill Stockwell, version 2. Okay. So that's the one we use. I can share with you the article that we published on that. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Really nice talk, Jose. Maybe it's not a scientific question, but curiosity, because you showed that when new leaves are forming, there is a decrease in the emission of isoprene, but an increase of emission of methanol.
Yeah.
Is there a kind of protection against animals or insects? Because at least for humans, methanol is kind of toxic.
Yeah.
Just curiosity.
Oh, actually, I do not know the reason why plants release methanol while the leaves are expanding. I really don't know whether it is a way to deter the herbivores from coming to damage the tissue, but I have not studied that aspect. There is a colleague of mine, though, who knows the answer, and he works in Brazil, Colby Jardim. Colby works in the Amazon, and he's associated with INPA. Yeah, he's a scientist at INPA, but his home base is in the Department of Energy laboratory at Berkeley, California. Yeah, but he has studied that aspect, but I do not know the reason. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry about the microphone, the battery is low. Do we have questions from the Google Meet or YouTube if you are monitoring, or Facebook, Richard? I see a bullet there, but I don't know if there is. Oh, can I?
No, I can't.
Can I make a question for you?
Sure. I have one.
Okay.
Eu acho que o Richard está fazendo. Tem?
E tem outro microfone? Esse morreu, parece.
There is a question. Can you
Can
read?
you read and answer?
Where's the question?
Here.
Oh, okay.
Can you read aloud and then?
Can you read it?
Yes, I can.
Because they
I will stay close to you so that everybody. here. So there is a question on YouTube from Diego Medeiros that a paper by Medeiros, I assume it's him, 2022, provides confirmation for OH formation from the isoprene oxidation via the thermal decomposition of, I don't know if I'll say this right, diage-carb species, suggested by Peters et al. The photolytic route of this IGPALD seems to be a minor channel branching fraction, approximately 0.25. Aren't any of these routes incorporated in the chemical model used in the study? That's the first question. Yeah. And then the second question is, couldn't the suppression of such routes overestimate the importance of ozonolysis route for OH formation, for example?
The answer is that we, yes, incorporated them in the photochemical mechanism that we had, and we actually agree with the model that, with the study that you cite, that the recycling of the hydroxyl radical via the reaction of the isoprene molecule is only a minute, a small contribution of the hydroxyl radical. The aldehydes, the higher aldehydes, yes, they can actually undergo further reactions that will lead to the formation of the formaldehyde. And there is yet again another small formation of the hydroxyl radical via the photolysis of the formaldehyde. But the key here is that deep in the canopy, there is almost no actinic lights to allow the photolysis of the formaldehyde. And so most of the hydroxyl radical that we computed, that we estimated with the large area simulation, comes via the ozonolysis of monoterpenes.
Okay, so I'll make my question now. Do you want to do yours?
Could you explain a little bit more? How did you measure the young leaves, the number of young leaves, and also the foliar area?
Yeah, actually,
because you show a time series of the decrease of vegetation index and plus the number of the young leaves.
Yeah. Actually, I should have said that in the presentation. The leaf area was determined with what we call a leaf area meter. The group that was doing the study was the Scott-Zaleska group, and they actually produced a Nature paper based on these results. The first author has the last name of Wu et al. That's where the article is cited. I should have mentioned this during the presentation.
But those measurements are
at the CF2. Those measurements were done at the CF2. Yeah, and they basically coincided when we were there as well. Yeah, Scott-Zaleska was the project leader. I believe Wu was either a postdoctoral a scholar working with Scott-Zaleska or a graduate student. I don't really know. Yeah.
So all your work is when you don't have clouds, right? Mostly. And I'm wondering, what is the impact of thunderstorms? I'm getting something from my side. Like lightning is one of the natural, actually the major natural source of NOx. And how do you think it can play a role, like minor role, of course, but how?
Well, there are several questions there. So first of all, we did make measurements when we had cloudy conditions. All the measurements were done during all the time, except when we didn't have power, because sometimes we had breaks in the power. We have published actually quite a few papers on how the mesoscale convective systems modify the chemistry that I outlined for you here today. And one of the key elements associated with mesoscale convective storms is that in the downdraft region of those storms, there is an inordinate amount of ozone that is transported from the mid-troposphere down to the surface. In fact, the ozone levels can go from 20 parts per billion all the way up to 60 parts per billion right there during the downdrafts. Tobias Gerken, who was a postdoctoral fellow working as part of the Go Amazon with me, Gilberto and many others in Brazil published half a dozen of articles on that topic. And then we also have the hydrocarbon data that we still, believe it or not, haven't published yet. When we have those episodes of the mesoscale convective storms passing by, or even the squall lines, when the squall line pass by. Cleo Quaresma from Belén has published a couple of articles outlining how the squall lines actually modified the chemistry in the atmospheric surface layer. Now, to the last question, that's a really, really good question as to how lightning impacts the formation. You mentioned nitric oxide, right? Because when you have lightning, you basically have that the lightning will burn the air. Air is mostly comprised of nitrogen and oxygen. You burn nitrogen and oxygen, you get 2 molecules of nitric oxide. So we did see a little bit of evidence of the transport of that, particularly when you have that the lightning is happening in cloud. When you have the lightning from base of the cloud down to the surface, we didn't see much. Now, the other question, or the other answer to your question is that there has been recent results that show that when we have lightning, there is an incredible amount of hydroxyl radical production. Bill Brune, who's my colleague in my department at Penn State, just published a science article on that topic that has been already cited many, many times. He also produced a very extensive article in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Atmospheres, outlining from the point of view of field observations. He has done a lot of field campaigns using aircrafts, and he has detected that the amounts of the hydroxyl radical that are produced due to the electrical discharge coming from the lightning is really, really large. And those results have not yet been incorporated in numerical models. So yet there is another justification, another motivation for doing more studies, because that process that you just identified has not been investigated in the Amazon. Bill Brune has done those studies only in the what we call the plains in the United States, meaning Oklahoma, in Nebraska, and also in Kansas, in that region there. And also he did another field campaign in South Korea. So those measurements come from what I would call mid-latitude regions. We have not studied them yet in the Amazon region. Excellent question.
Okay. You.
You mentioned early in the lecture about the importance of the turbulence in the models that you were using. My question is that with the rise of the temperature, the warming of the airs, and the increase of maybe winds can alter the turbulence, and how it would influence the models that you're using.
Yeah. So I would say to you that from first principles, if we basically heat up the fluid air, the turbulence is going to change, simply because the buoyancy term that you have in the equation, if you go back to learning how the turbulence kinetic energy is developed or formed in the atmosphere, we have one that is driven by what we call wind shear, the variation of the wind speed in the vertical sense. The second dominant term is the buoyancy term, where we have basically the kinematic heat flux multiplied by the temperature in that air layer that we have. So from first principles, we can say, yes, if we heat up the column of the atmosphere, let's say by 1, 2, or 3 degrees Celsius, then we will impact the turbulence. And the second kind of related answer to your question is that when we heat up the lower layers of the atmosphere, then the convection is going to also be intensified, and as a result, we should experience deeper convective bound layers over the region where the warming is taking place. And this process, by the way, have not been extensively investigated yet. So right now, all the studies that, like the one I share here with you, are only done for a year. We were so lucky to do our field studies for almost a year. Most field studies are done for field campaigns that last 2 to 3 or 4 weeks. That's it. And so we need to really do these studies in a more systematic manner, in my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have to close. So thank you very much, Jose, one more time.
Oh, muito obrigado a você.
De nada. Okay.